Do you believe that cancel culture is ruthless? Consider, if you will, the events of 1326 in medieval England. In that unforgiving era, the fate of Hugh Despenser was not merely a form of social ostracism. It culminated in an execution so brutal it eclipses even the most graphic scenes from shows like Game of Thrones. Picture this: a man dragged naked through the streets, his body exposed and vulnerable, while thousands of onlookers, some of them children, shout for his demise. Amidst this horrific spectacle sits the queen he betrayed, observing from a raised platform, sipping wine as his disembowelment unfolds. This isn't a figment of storytelling. Historical records, including eyewitness accounts, attest to this chilling reality. What led to such a gruesome fate for the king's corrupt favorite? It is a tale of excess and depravity centered around one man whose rise to power entangled an entire kingdom, only to meet with public dismemberment. We are about to delve into the life of Hugh Despenser, whose unbridled ambition shaped his destiny and eventually triggered a fierce reckoning that the people of England branded as justice. Now, rewind to 1316. A relatively obscure knight by the name of Hugh Despenser the Younger receives an appointment as royal chamberlain. At first glance, this may seem like a mundane role, a mere footnote in the annals of history. But this position endowed him with unprecedented authority, effectively making him the most powerful unelected official in England. Imagine a single individual wielding the power to control all communication with the president. Emails, texts, calls. This is the medieval equivalent of Hugh's newfound influence. Far from being a simple administrative role, it was absolute power camouflaged under the guise of clerical responsibilities. You might consider the assistant to a powerful executive to be overstepping their bounds when they control access to the boss's calendar. But Hugh Despenser took it to an entirely different level, possessing the ability to determine life or death based upon which messages reached the king. King Edward II had become so reliant on Hugh that he was rendered nearly incapable of governance without him. This relationship was not characterized by a mere advisory role. Hugh essentially became the puppet master, transforming the English government into his private domain. Hugh's ascent to power tells a tantalizing story about manipulation and ambition. He wasn't selected for any bravery on the battlefield or for his diplomatic finesse. Rather, he was chosen because he possessed an uncanny ability to speak the right words at pivotal moments. Within weeks of taking the Chamberlain position, he restructured the entire royal household to place himself at its center. Imagine a typical day in Edward II's court after Hugh's takeover. As dawn breaks, he arrives at the king's chambers to find mounds of letters awaiting. But instead of allowing the king to read every correspondence, he meticulously decides which letters will be viewed and which will not. Missives from the Earl of Lancaster raising concerns about taxation. Into the flames they go. Complaints from the Bishop of Winchester regarding corruption. Hugh will handle that himself. By the afternoon, nobles from across the realm, some of the most powerful and influential figures, line up for audiences with the king. Many have traveled weeks, investing vast fortunes to gain entrance to the court, yet they find their access strictly controlled by Hugh. For instance, Lord Berkeley, one of the strongest barons in England, once waited 6 months for a 5-minute audience, thanks solely to Hugh's petty vendettas. The chronicles from that time emphasize Hugh's bitter recollection of perceived slights. Evenings are reserved for the King's Council, traditionally comprising the most powerful nobles and church leaders in England. Yet, by 1320, Hugh orchestrated the removal of anyone who posed even a hint of opposition, ultimately creating a council that resonated with his own opinions and desires. The financial ramifications of his control were staggering. By 1322, Hugh and his father had siphoned roughly 40% of the royal revenue, equivalent to £8,000 annually, into their personal coffers, a sum large enough to purchase several castles or sponsor a small army. A specific illustration of this deep-rooted corruption can be found in 1321. A merchant named William Deepole sought a license for wool exports, a request typically accompanied by a fee of 20 marks. Hugh, however, demanded 500 marks and an additional 10% of all future profits. When William rightly complained to Edward II, Hugh intercepted the grievance and had him imprisoned for disturbing the royal peace. In a desperate effort to secure his freedom, William's family ultimately paid 1,000 marks, exemplifying the extortionate practices that had seeped into the fabric of royal governance. Perhaps most troubling is the fact that Edward II not only acknowledged these abuses but appeared to revel in Hugh's ruthless efficiency, referring to him as "my dear and faithful Hugh," even while the nobility suffered under his cruelty. To comprehend the extraordinary rise of Hugh Despenser, it is crucial to understand the dynamics of medieval court life. The royal chamberlain was never meant to wield significant power. He was merely intended to be a glorified scheduler. However, Edward II possessed qualities that made him vulnerable to a profound need for emotional validation combined with an evident inability to govern effectively. His personality became an exploitable weakness, a fact not lost on Hugh Despenser, who recognized that by rendering himself indispensable to Edward's daily life, he could effectively govern the entire nation. This storyline doesn't end without acknowledging the history of Edward II's previous favorite, Piers Gaveston, who met a violent destiny at the hands of angry barons in 1312. However, while Gaveston was flamboyant and antagonistic, Hugh was strategic and composed. Supporting Hugh's system offered tangible rewards. Compliance could lead to favorable decisions in legal battles, tax advantages, or lucrative appointments, while opposition could lead to your demise, even if it didn't overtly breach the law. Caught in a vicious bind, the barons faced a perilous dilemma. Opposing Hugh equated to betraying the king, a death sentence labeled treason, yet supporting him meant complicity in the dismantling of the kingdom's traditional power structures. Many opted for a third path, waiting in silence for a change that they hoped would come. Today's executive assistants may have the power to influence scheduling, but imagine if they could imprison you for voicing discontent over meeting times. It raises a deep appreciation for our modern systems of transparent governance and accountability. We often lament political corruption, yet at least today's officials must operate with some degree of subtlety. In contrast, Hugh Despenser exploited the English treasury as if it were his own personal ATM, manipulating the justice system to exact revenge. The most alarming aspect: every action he took was technically legal, underpinned by the authority of the king. However, controlling access to royal audiences was just the starting point of Hugh's grand scheme. In medieval politics, power wasn't solely about wealth and influence. It hinged on completely obliterating one's enemies so that they could never rise again. Hugh identified Queen Isabella of France, who should have been his strongest political ally, as a formidable threat in need of destruction. Once he had the king's undivided attention, he set about systematically dismantling Isabella's existence, a decision that would lead to one of the most dramatic acts of retribution being orchestrated in medieval history. Around 1324, after 16 years on the throne, Queen Isabella had established her position through shrewd navigation of court politics and the birth of heirs. Yet, Hugh Despenser determined that she should be subjugated and dismantled not through assassination, but through complete ruin. Imagine if your significant other's best friend suddenly controlled your finances, monitored your correspondence, and dictated your social interactions. This gives context to Isabella's grim reality. This scenario was not merely typical medieval maneuvering. It was a brutal, personal vendetta masquerading as administrative efficiency. If you think family divorces are turbulent now, Hugh Despenser set a nightmarish precedent for a public and personal war designed to completely humiliate England's queen. Isabella's plight was marked by the horrifying symbolism of control, reminiscent of stripping bark from a tree. In September 1324, Hugh Despenser executed a calculated seizure of power that left Isabella stripped of her royal authority. Under the pretext of the ongoing conflict with France, he orchestrated the forfeiture of 28 of Isabella's estates, properties worth an astonishing £20,000 annually, more than most duchies could generate in revenue. The process itself was chilling. Royal clerks arrived at various estates at dawn, simultaneously reading identical mandates that declared the Queen's properties confiscated for the safety of the realm. Isabella's own financial records reveal her despair. "I am treated worse than a merchant's wife, for even they keep their dowries." This was only the initial act of Hugh's orchestrated downfall of Isabella. Shortly thereafter, he ordered the arrest of her French servants, 31 individuals seized during coordinated nighttime raids without trial, no evidence presented, only Hugh's malevolent judgments claiming they posed a threat. Included among those arrested were her physician, a man who had served her since she was a child, and countless other loyal aides. The Chronicle of London recounts that Isabella wept openly in court, but none dared comfort her for fear of Despenser's wrath. Hugh further targeted Isabella's children, the very future of England's royal lineage. 8-year-old Prince John was taken from her household and placed in the care of Hugh's wife, Eleanor de Clare, while 6-year-old Princess Eleanor was moved to Hugh's properties in Wales. Isabella was allowed only one supervised visit per month while Hugh's agents monitored their conversations. An incident in Scotland in 1325 highlights the depths of Hugh's vendetta. Isabella was on her way to negotiate peace, a legitimate royal duty, but Hugh rescinded her military escort just as she entered a contested area, leaving her dangerously exposed to capture by the Scots. It was a miraculous intervention by local monks that saved her from imminent danger. Hugh's comment upon hearing of her narrow escape was chilling, one less problem to manage if the Scots had done their job. As Christmas 1324 approached, a time typically reserved for royal family gatherings, Hugh ensured Isabella was seated not beside the king but beneath the Sultan, a front akin to being relegated to the children's table. Foreign ambassadors expressed shock at witnessing such demeaning treatment of the Queen. Isabella's correspondence from this period reveals a staggering decline in her mental health. "I am a prisoner without walls, a queen without authority, a mother without children, a wife without a husband's protection." To fully grasp the horror of Isabella's circumstances, one must understand the traditional dynamics of queenship in medieval Europe. A queen's power stemmed from three principal sources: her landed wealth, her household, and her status as a mother to royal heirs. Hugh systematically assailed each of these pillars. The seizure of Isabella's estates was a financial blow, but it also stripped her of political agency. With no land of her own, she lacked the means to reward allies, form alliances, or exercise influence in court. She was reduced to waiting on whatever allowance Hugh would condescend to grant her. Hugh's removal of her French servants further stoked xenophobic tensions amidst ongoing conflict between England and France. Yet, these servants were not spies. They were Isabella's connections to her heritage, her childhood, and her identity as a French princess. By isolating her emotionally, Hugh rendered her increasingly vulnerable. Perhaps the most cruel blow of all was the removal of access to her children. Medieval queens derived a significant portion of their power from their roles as mothers. By controlling Isabella's access to her children, Hugh not only stifled her emotional support but strategically dismantled any potential power base she might have had, leaving her without leverage even should King Edward II pass away. Even more insidiously, every action taken by Hugh was carefully cloaked in the veneer of legality. He wielded royal writs and proper documentation to justify his actions, never technically breaking the law. The French chroniclers describe this period as tyranny masquerading as bureaucracy. The degree of Edward II's complicity remains a point of contention among historians. Was he willfully ignorant, or simply a pawn so dependent on Hugh that he believed these actions were necessary? Some accounts indicate that Edward absorbed all judgments through Hugh's perspective, unable to see the larger implications of his favorite's actions. In contrast to today's custody battles, which at least provide some semblance of equitable remedies, Isabella's plight offered no such options. Imagine losing your children not due to unfitness but because a power-hungry associate headed out for you. This is the stark reality faced by the Queen. Hugh Despenser was utilizing coercive control methods that modern psychology would recognize as abusive, systematic emotional torture, isolation, financial exploitation, and maternal alienation. He effectively wrote the manual on how to dismantle someone's life without lifting a finger. However, he miscalculated in his assessment of Queen Isabella. She was no ordinary noble woman. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, a formidable figure capable of vengeance. Taking her children became the pivotal moment that ignited Isabella's resolve. It was then she determined that Hugh Despenser must not just die but be completely obliterated, never to be remembered in England again, as a warning to anyone who dared to violate a queen. Yet, even as Isabella planned retribution, Hugh continued to amass a growing list of enemies. In an audacious move that seemed straight out of a pirate novel, Hugh Despenser, during a brief exile in 1321, took to the high seas as a pirate, attacking English merchant ships. This wasn't a desperate attempt to survive. It was a blatant act of defiance against a kingdom that had temporarily cast him out. While most exiled nobles sought refuge in France or Italy following political upheaval, Hugh chose instead to commandeer a ship and engage in piracy across the English Channel. Imagine the chaos that might ensue if a recently dismissed chief of staff from the White House turned to looting cargo vessels. The sheer audacity of such actions would resonate loudly through history, and for Hugh Despenser, it served as a precursor to his eventual, violent downfall. This story, not merely one of ambition and power but of betrayal and retribution, illustrates the tumultuous intersection of personal vendettas and political maneuvering in medieval England, where the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and legacy. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to support our work and never miss an upload. Like this video, drop a comment, and share it with others to show your support and help us grow this historical community.